Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name is Alexandra Alarcon and I am a fourth year student here at UCSB. I am also a social media and web intern for the UCSB's Humanity and Fine Arts Division. I'm honored to be moderating our winter installment of HFA Speaks, Life Beyond Lockdown, COVID's 5-year legacy. As we approach the 5-year mark since we went into quarantine, we thought now would be a great time to explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced the humanities, fine arts, and higher education. Today, we will explore lasting effects of the lockdown on these fields 5 years later. Please hold all questions till the end, as I will leave time for the audience to ask the panelists questions. Without further ado, let's welcome the 3 panelists joining us today. First, we have Professor Letty García, an assistant professor of theater and dance at UCSB. Thank you for joining us today. Professor Garcia's research focuses on Shakespeare, critical race theory, Latinx and Chicanx, film and theater, and performance theory. She is also an advocate for the arts and community-oriented education. Next, we have Professor Nathan Roberts, a lecturer in the Film and Media Studies Department. Thank you for being here. Professor Roberts' research combines film theory, history, and analysis to explore how media has shaped ethical values and how these values may be revived in the present day. He also teaches a course at UCSB about movie-going habits post-COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, we have Nomi Morris, a continuing lecturer in the writing program at UCSB. Professor Morris is also the director of the journalism track in the professional writing minor. She's a former international journalist who was Time Magazine's Berlin correspondent. Thank you for your participation, and let's dive right in. First off, I have a question for you, Professor Garcia. How has the pandemic changed the rehearsal and performance processes, both during social distancing and since?
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone. This was such a cool question, and we were just sort of chit-chatting about it as the event was getting started. I think it's obviously had a complete overhaul. Can you all hear me? Yes. A complete overhaul in the ways in which we rehearse and even perform that I think it still has these lasting after effects. When the pandemic started, I remember, my anniversary here is also coincides with the pandemic, so I feel like I've been in the twilight zone, and now we're like coming out of it a little bit. But I remember during the pandemic, I had all these shows slated, and they quickly, some of them just went away, disappeared altogether. Most of them tried to pivot to an online form. I think that got better over time. But overall, we were rehearsing on Zoom, over Skype, on the phone. Questions of access or points of access, I should say, changed. So I found that to be, probably all of us can relate to this as well in the pandemic, it really reminded us or took us back to this point of community, which is what theater is all about. And I think it really opened up these avenues of access that were possible. And we were able to I was part of different productions that were doing things in places that I wouldn't have been able to do because we were online. And I remember I joined Guillermo Gomez Peña, who's a really prolific Chicano Mexican performance artist. And he was like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing at my house. Like, I'm just gonna turn on the Zoom camera and like see what happens. He's like, it's not scripted. It was like one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And it was not totally improvised because Guillermo's Guillermo and he's a genius. But that would have not been possible would it not be for the pandemic and the kind of, situation that we're in. So overall, to keep it short, or I guess long story short now, it completely overhauled the rehearsal process, even I think in thinking about the plays that we do, like what kinds of cast sizes, crew sizes. As we've come back more fully on stage, we're still dealing with this, and we have these protocols in place for like what happens if someone gets sick and how do we isolate that. So it's just been a complete overhaul, I would say, in a good and a bad way.
Thank you so much for that response. And then Professor Roberts, I have a question for you. How has the COVID-19 pandemic altered both production processes and the way audiences view cinema today?
Yeah, again, a really great question, and thanks for having me. In terms of production processes, let's start with that. So at the moment, and I picked the brain of friends of mine that are in film production to be like, what's happening right now? because for a while there were these very extensive COVID protocols in terms of cleaning and particularly testing and so on and so forth. And a lot of larger films were able to, and by that I mean like larger budget, like bigger films, were able to still function fairly well, but that was really hard on independent films because these protocols were so expensive. And so now, in general, those protocols are no longer required. I think it's more common for people to wear masks on set, especially with films that have short shooting schedules, because if you have a short shooting schedule and everyone gets sick, that like ruins your ability to make the film, especially if scheduling is difficult with all the different crew members and actors and so on and so forth. And also, like, even in television, like I have a friend who works on the ABC show, the Ryan Murphy ABC show, Dr. Odyssey, and she was working remotely. I was hanging out with her last fall, and basically everything, all these flurry of emails came around about the production shutting down, and it was this huge thing, and people didn't know why, and it was extremely stressful, and it was just one of the leads got COVID, right? So this is something that is still happening. Even on TV shows, and can be extremely complicated just because it's such a difficult process of putting all these things together. And I also asked a friend who's a production designer about this, and she said there were two things that she mentioned to me. One, she said it changed things in terms of collaboration. In LA especially, a lot of people worked in film just because they were local, and it was a local industry that was thriving and fairly easy to get, on a production in some way or another, even if it was just a PA or something like that, production assistant. It became less easy during the pandemic, and people started doing other things, while at the same time, other people sort of, quit their job in the Great Resignation and thought, maybe I'll try filmmaking. I've always wanted to do it. So collaborations and the people actually working in the industry changed over. There was a sort of turnover in some rather major ways, and also people who were older retired, right? People who were thinking about retiring anyway often retired earlier, which happened in academia too. It happened all across the board, right? And so the second thing that she said is very similar to what you said in terms of safety. There's just a lot more sensitivity towards safety protocols on set, and if someone, in general, and if someone were to bring up a concern on a set, that would be taken seriously in a way that it wouldn't necessarily have been taken seriously before. So those were the two things that she brought up to me. And in terms of reception, this I can make shorter because I think we'll talk about it more in a bit, but in terms of reception, streaming was already popular before the pandemic, but in a sense, streaming became altogether more popular and a default mode of watching things for a lot of people. Going to the theater became something that isn't necessarily as common, especially among older adults or families that have trouble getting out of the house with a bunch of kids, or people who just simply don't want to leave. So we can talk more about that. I'll just leave it there. But that was, I would say, even more than in production, perhaps like a major change in terms of how films are being received.
Yes, actually I wanted to ask you a little bit more on that topic. So did the rise of streaming services during the pandemic accelerate the decline of traditional movie theaters? And do you think movie theaters will someday be as popular as they once are? Building on that, is the rise in streaming services because of convenience, or is there still some sort of fear of getting too close to people?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I'll try not to speak too long on them, but I could. And I guess we'll talk some more. But I mean, so at a macro level, yes. Going to the film in 2024 and in 2023 and 2024, I think there were about 33% fewer people going to the movies than in 2019. That's a third. That is a third, and that is a major disruption of a market. On the other hand, I will say that particularly in places like New York and LA, sort of more, we could say, niche art house revival movie houses, I actually think after the pandemic have become even more popular. the filmmaker David Lynch just died. I've gone to some screenings of his older films in Los Angeles, and those screenings have sold out like this. And I go to these screenings and I see actually not just like Gen Xers who really liked the show Twin Peaks that he made, but a lot of young people too. So, you know, these are cities where there are people who are often in creative industries or already primed to appreciate the cinematic experience. But nevertheless, I think it is seen as something that is more of like a niche privilege, you know, something that is a really sort of, something that is more special and not quite so taken for granted. And I would say I would argue that it's not just because there are creatives in New York and LA. I would say that it's also just the access. Like, these buildings exist in these places, and I'm sure you could find examples of sort of smaller micro cinemas across the country that are also actually doing quite well. So, but that's on obviously a much smaller scale than the scale of, say, AMC or Cinemark or some of these larger companies. And then I guess, sorry, what was the second part?
I know that was a loaded one. Is there a fear of getting too close to people in the movie theaters still?
Yeah. Well, this could maybe transition to a more collective conversation. I think there might be, in some sense, maybe, I think the notion of being too close to people is actually a really productive and interesting idea. Like, what does it mean to be too close to someone? I would say that in general, the question of sort of atmosphere and the atmosphere in which something is watched has actually really come to the fore, because, you know, at your home you can have a closed atmosphere or a controlled atmosphere, right? You can set the lights the way you want, you know, and at this point technology is accessible enough and affordable enough that you can watch things on 4K on a really large television for a much more affordable price point than even 10 years ago or something like that. So you have this sort of the closed atmosphere, which can be preferable to an atmosphere in which, say, someone might be on their phone, or someone might, you know, be eating food that smells bad. Or there was actually just an article in the New York Times that I would recommend people look at if you're interested in this, about a laughter epidemic in movie theaters, which is people laughing at potentially the wrong times, or what is arguably the wrong time. And I've definitely noticed people laughing a lot in the movies, and someone might not want that. But at the same time, someone might argue that sense of being with other people and responding to them, especially when it comes to comedies or these other forms that really demand a kind of collective response, is actually part of the joy of going to the movies in the first place. So when you're too close to people, it can be oppressive, but it can also be collectively enlightening and liberating. And that's, I think, part of why people are going to see films at these movie houses. So speaking of David Lynch, I just went to a screening of Blue Velvet a couple nights ago, and that film has some sequences that are incredibly uncomfortable. And to be in a theater with people who are laughing uncomfortably just made the emotional impact of the movie that much higher. So I'm sure in theater there are sort of similar questions that you're thinking about as well. So
yeah, if you'd like to build on that, Professor Garcia?
Yeah, that was very insightful, thank you. So I think one of the things we talk a lot about in theater, and I'm such a fan of this, because I think streaming culture also impacted theater and performing arts in a huge, massive way that was, I would say, probably unprecedented at the time. And I remember very vividly, this might have been like April, May, the National Theatre of England was like, we're gonna put all of the shows online, or we're gonna start doing these national screenings like for free on YouTube. And they started with One Man, Two Governors. And it had something like, don't fact check me on this, don't cancel me internet. They had like millions of people watch it because they made it free and it was on YouTube. And then they kept it free for like a month. And then they were like, we're swapping it out with something else. So it made something that was once really inaccessible, accessible again, which to me is always really astounding with theater, because theater has its origins in community and the people. And the original storytellers are the first indigenous peoples everywhere. So it's something that everybody has access to, but has become this high art protected thing. And I feel like the pandemic was able to kind of break us free from that a little bit. And so I find that now a lot more theater is accessible because it's available for streaming, or you can rent it. Or I tell my students, hey, we're gonna watch this National Theatre production. You have to pay $10 for it, but that beats a flight to London and a ticket, right? So I think streaming And that kind of access of content has also been a little bit revolutionary for us in the theater and the performing arts in the dance world. And I even think of things like, well, remember Beyonce, the Coachella Beyonce? That was like a watershed, right, for all of us. And the access of that, right, that it was free, you could just watch it. So it's been amazing. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Oh no, thank you so much for
Yeah,
that
no,
response.
it's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Professor Morris.
What you just said really reminded me of how book readings went online in the writing community. And those were usually limited to local bookstores or sometimes paid if they were bigger. And there were all these great readings for free everywhere on Zoom. But that didn't persist. Like if we're talking about the kinds of things that stayed and didn't stay, I was able to incorporate into my courses, my creative writing course, the creative nonfiction, that students had to attend a reading because it was on Zoom and they could tune into New York. And in the last couple of years, that hasn't been the case. So that was one thing that occurred to me about writing.
Let's bring it back.
Yeah, but while I have the mic, should I just say some other effects on writing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so as you know, writing, if you're a novelist or possibly a poet, is already a solitary endeavor, and a lot of writers felt really guilty during COVID, how disruptive it was to everyone else, and they were saying, well, here I am still in my in my bedroom or in my hovel or whatever, doing my writing. For journalists, I come from the world of journalism, it was a lot tougher because so much of great journalism is witnessing something live and interviewing people in person, and that had to all be over Zoom. So that's gone away, and everybody's gone back to doing it the way it was. In the professional community, among students, I've had a harder time getting journalism students to feel comfortable with the in-person interview after starting their journalism experience by interviewing exclusively on Zoom or FaceTime or whatever. Even after they didn't have to anymore, they were almost preferring that. And I had to kind of push them, no, you have to meet with this person in person. So those were just, a few of the things that I was thinking about in terms of the effect on writing and writing communities.
Thank you so much. And then I have a question for all the panelists, so whoever wants to start us off, feel free. How did the COVID-19 pandemic create positive opportunities in the post-pandemic world in these fields?
Let me think. Well, I think I was just touching on it. This question of access, I think, is so important to the kind of cultivation and the carrying on of the performing arts, not just theater, but like dance, music. Professor Robster, we're just talking about it as well. I think it's allowed us to think more creatively about what's possible on maybe a smaller dime, or thinking more large scale and being just kind of out of the box about it. I've seen some really incredible pieces come to life because of the pandemic, and different modalities, and I think that has been, what was the question? Was it a positive effect?
Yeah, just positive opportunities that have been created.
I think for me, I'm witnessing they're just all creative, and we're able to sort of think kind of, boots on the ground, thinking about how are we going to make this happen.
Yeah, sort of related to the question of access. I mean, film, unlike theater, has this sort of like built into it, this kind of democratic dimension, especially since the beginning, right? It was sort of since the late 19th century, sort of seen as a low art, right? Precisely because you had Nickelodeons, right? The term Nickelodeon refers to a nickel, right? It cost you a nickel to go to the movies. But nevertheless, I think when we haven't been able to watch movies in person for a while, and then you get to go back to watch films in certain contexts, it can allow you to think about, well, what is possible here? What is the joy? What are ways of viewing that can be really exciting? Again, rather than just taking for granted, this kind of infrastructure of going to the AMC or whatever. So just to name a personal example, like I have a friend who during the pandemic started having outdoor movie screenings on his front yard. And eventually this friend thought that maybe I think he secretly knew that I would take this even further. So he got a bunch of my mutual friends to buy me a 4K projector for my birthday, knowing that I would then invest in an even better screen, and even better sound, and that sort of thing. And so now have like a setup for a very high quality micro cinema that I now sort of bring around to different venues and different people's houses. And I don't charge, I'll never charge for this, right? But I think the collective experience of going to the film is something that I love being able to provide, and going to all these sort of different venues. So that sort of sense, I think, of we had to be flexible, right? We had to have outdoor screenings. People started going to drive-ins again during the pandemic. I think people watched Tenet at drive-ins, right? Like so we had to be flexible, but I think once you unlock your brain from a certain sort of prescriptive way of doing things according to, well, let's say like just the market, essentially, like what is sort of seen as normative and profitable, like once you're able to detach your brain from those ways of doing things, it can open up different opportunities. And I would say, at least for me, the kind of collective communal aspect of going to the cinema has been sort of revitalized in these unpredictable ways. So.
Do you want anything to add? Okay, great. And then you guys are all faculty here at UCSB. So we are curious about how, during the COVID-19, educators had to adapt and change how they taught students content.
Okay, I'll start us off on that one, which kind of has to do with opportunities as well, because we were all under a lot of stress when this happened. We had to completely revamp our courses, but out of that came a lot more openness to using different digital technologies in our teaching. I mean, some of us were so inclined, but not all of us. And those have definitely persisted and made their ways into the courses. So for one thing, Zoom, of course, well, we really love being back in the classroom. Or maybe we love it more than the students do, I don't know. But the ability to use Zoom, like Zoom has become so ubiquitous that it really comes in handy. Like if you're traveling somewhere, you don't have to cancel your class anymore. And videos, like I had made mini lectures on video for all my courses, and I still use that now in my courses. So something that existed before called the flipped class, where the lecture material is on video and you use the class time all for discussion, that was completely accelerated. So there have been benefits in that regard. From the student point of view, also, I think there are downsides and upsides. In one regard, students have definitely become a lot more resilient. On the downside, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues, and I think we've all noticed that there's been a change in student learning and student behavior. A good point, again, is that I think there's more informality between faculty and students that came with that period of being flexible and understanding what the students were going through. One never knew what was going on in their families, so there was a lot of leniency and so on. A downside of that is that in the I come from the professional world, there's a lot of emphasis put on good communication and meeting deadlines and things like that. And I think students, because of that period, have a harder time with that, have a harder time meeting those kinds of expectations. There was a bit of an anything goes kind of thing going on. I see my colleague nodding. So that's been one kind of effect from students. And also I think students are still feeling the effects of the trauma of that period. One of my colleagues mentioned that to me. But definitely in the area of deadlines, instructions, communication, performance. And as I mentioned before, students were already inclined to communicate via text and chat and not pick up a phone or do one-on-one. And in journalism, it's really the opposite. Like most of journalism takes place over the phone, for example. So it's become even harder to get students over that hump of like the personal connection with the other people in the job.
Definitely.
I will echo everything you just said. Yes. I feel like students were very much so traumatized. I think we all were, and we're kind of coming out of it a little bit in this crazy world that we live in. I felt like it allowed me to sort of rethink my teaching. How am I communicating this material? It's one thing to stand in front of people and you see me and you read my body and my cues, and I can place emphasis on things, but behind a screen, it's a totally different world. So it made me really kind of think about how my pedagogy, how am I teaching, how does this make sense if I'm teaching Hamlet in a classroom versus Hamlet on Zoom, which is possible. But I think to me it helped my teaching in many ways. I think my students, it has been a bit of a push and pull, a lot of ups and a lot of downs. I think one thing that I see more so now with my students is, I won't call it an unwillingness, but a hesitancy to sort of participate because it's so public. It's so, like, I have to say something, and I have my students who come up to me, and I love my students dearly, and they're always like, well, I wanted to say this, but I'm too nervous, and I'm like, it's okay. And I feel like we're slowly getting back to that, and I'm always encouraging, if you've been in my class, you know that I will make you talk about your feelings. So, as is the nature of the theater, right, that is the arts. So, to me, I feel like my students have changed hugely in my career, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and hoping that we get back to more, I don't even know, it's not normalcy, but more, not connection, I don't know what it is, but I'm sure you both can agree with me. I'll stop talking.
No, I definitely agree with what both of you said. I think the only thing that I would add is, you know, as soon as classes moved over onto Zoom, yeah, pedagogy began to be rethought according to the medium. And, you know, they're already pretty early, even in the pandemic, there were studies done about how it's just harder to pay attention to a lecture on a screen that goes on and on. I've definitely experienced that. So part of what was encouraged is, you know, the use of breakout rooms and answering questions in the chat and this kind of interactivity. And I would say, in general, I think interactivity is, you know, it's a great thing. But I think then when you come back into maybe more of a lecture form, I found that students have a lot more trouble following along in a lecture that is more of a literary or oratorical kind of form, the way traditional lectures are. Because in some ways you have to train your brain to really follow the line of thought that goes throughout 45 minutes, you know, to an hour or longer, right? And so, you know, I don't necessarily begrudge students that difficulty because our minds are shaped and wired by the technology and the media that we're using all the time. But nevertheless, I do, in some ways, feel for them as much as I feel for my own attenuated attention span due to the social and digital media that I'm using that's just, you know, destroying my attention span all the time, right? So it's like I'm a victim to this as much as anybody else, but I have, you know, and you could, again, maybe someone could argue that everything should just be more interactive and the older type of lecture is something that should be seen as an antiquated modality. I wouldn't necessarily argue that. I think there's still affordances to that sort of mode of more literary oratorical lecturing, but how we can sort of revitalize that, and if we should revitalize that, I think is an open question that the pandemic leaves us with.
May I add something to that? I also think in the kind of larger schematic of academia, which is where we are at the institution, right, it was massive, right? I had colleagues retire, as you were saying, because the pivot to online was just too much. Colleagues all over the world, you know, I have one of my best friends, she's a professor in Canada, and she was like, you know, all the faculty, the senior faculty that have been here for like 35 years, they just left because it was just too much. And also, I think that has been a little bit of a reckoning that we're still dealing with, or even here on campus, right? The institution's like, we must use Canvas. And I have very dear colleagues that are like, but why? Like, I've done it for years and years and I haven't needed it. So I feel like it's also, on a macro level, it has really, I don't know, just changed a lot of things. And how we think about, if you're sick, don't come to class, join on Zoom, if you know all that stuff.
Definitely. Thank you all for those answers. At this point, we're going to open up the discussion to the audience. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And yeah, Jackie.
Hi, thank you for coming, by the way. This has been really insightful as a student. So my question is, for the three of you, you all work in a field where you produce something artistic. And I was wondering, I think the immediate conversation after the pandemic was that the pandemic itself switched maybe the genres or the kinds of art that people want to go see. So maybe people were searching for something that was kind of more like escapism. 5 years later, do you see that still? Has that created like a shift in demand, I guess, by your audiences?
That's a great question. Let me mull that over.
I have an immediate.
Go ahead. Well, I was gonna say, I'm reading like Hornswoggle and Roses, which is like totally escapist right now. So I think that it's been a balance, but I'll let Professor Robert speak first and then I'll.
So the films that have done well have been quote-unquote event films, and in fact sometimes a double event film in the case of the infamous Barbenheimer event, right? Which is when Barbie and Oppenheimer came out at the same time. But you could say that even this year, Wicked did extremely well because people have been waiting to see a Wicked film for a very long time. Inside Out 2 made incredible amounts of money, in part because generations of children now have watched the original Inside Out, making the sequel an event film. And I think this relates to what I was saying earlier about these sort of like, you know, revival houses in LA and these sort of, these spaces where people like to go out and, I mean, you know, I talk about this with my class. I had them, you know, raise their hands if they owned a film camera and shot on film. So many of them did. So many of them did, right? So people are shooting on film. They're going out to see 35 millimeter prints because that's a special event kind of thing. So I'd say it's less of a question of genre and more of what makes something special in terms of either the, in the case of Wicked, right, you know, this particular, you know, musical, or in the case of the media, right, in the case of literally medium specificity in terms of film. So that's one thing I think that is, yeah, really drawing people out.
And I think in terms of, I would say that the answer is yes, like in terms of content, right? I think about, I always ask my students, what are you watching? Whether it's theatrical or on TV, like what show are you watching? I feel like that became such a prevalent question in the pandemic. What are you watching, right? Tell me. What are you listening to, like podcasts? Because I think we were so starved for something during the pandemic where we were not allowed to participate fully in the way that we used to, that's become such a normal question. And my students are always like, oh, what's the Pedro Pascal zombie show? The Last of Us, which was a video game, right? Like all of these adaptations, right, that are coming from these different like universes in a way. So I think for me, the answer is there is always that, and it's allegorical, of course, it's all of these things that we can read into it, but I find myself, like, I'm so excited the Cursed Child, the new Harry Potter play is coming to LA. I was like, I'm gonna go see it, right? So I think we are hungry for that, and I always say to my students, I mean, this is not Brechtian. We're not gonna learn and suffer. Like, you know, so let's like have fun with it as well, but.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess this is an open question as well. I was wondering how, sorry, I was wondering, thank you for coming by the way. Sorry, I was just wondering how the COVID-19 pandemic, like, affected the balance of power between like filmmakers or you know, choreographers, writers, and their editors / you know, producers, all that.
My husband's a filmmaker. Hi, Michael. You're gonna watch this one day. And he's an independent filmmaker. So I think that from what I experienced and witnessed, there was a kind of newfound flexibility that was afforded to like filmmakers who were used to doing this like on a really small scale, on a really tight shoe. So I feel like things like independent cinema in a way like not took off, but like had a bit of a resurgence. And I think that there was that shift in power a little bit, and also what you were touching on, which is this idea that, you know, streaming became so mainstream in a way that there's been all these conversations about, well, why is this nominated for an Oscar? It's on Netflix, and like, is that okay? And right, these questions of high art and low art, I think, are coming into play, are imbued in your question about power, right? Which is, in terms of the industry, film industry, a theater now is about money, and there's always a bottom line. So when something like, I don't know, Cats tanks at the box office, that's like not great for you, like Universal Pictures, but then they have something like Wicked, and it's kind of that. So I think the question about power is really important because it's economic and it's cultural, right, in a way. I don't know if you want to answer that.
No, I think that's great. I think it's still to sort of be seen exactly how this will turn out, or how this will affect power dynamics in the long term. But I'm thinking about, right now Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival is happening, and some of the films, but not all of them, are available to stream, which of course did not happen before the pandemic. And I think it's an interesting balance to see which filmmakers decide to allow their films to be streamed and which ones, in fact, don't, and how that affects the capacity of a film to be purchased by a distributor or not. And, I'm not behind the scenes, and again, this is still pretty new, so I think it's hard to have any sort of empirical conclusions here. But I'll just say it's quite interesting, right? Because part of the point of Sundance initially is that Robert Redford really liked to ski in Park City, and so he created a festival there. And the ambiance of going to a festival is often seen as being integral to the success of a film, sometimes to a fault. South by Southwest is known for having audiences that are so enthusiastic about films that people get sort of false impressions about how good the film is. This is, again, speaking about the effect of audiences. Like last year when Fall Guy came out at South by, everyone was like, best movie of the year, and then came into the theaters and people were like, it's fun, but maybe not the best movie of the year, but the South by audiences loved it, right? So, anyway, I don't know if this is a definite answer, but I think it's like, clearly it must have an effect on the ways that films are being seen and distributed, and the sort of the way that affects the dynamics of the producers, the creators, and the distributors. But I don't know if anyone can say definitively, what that effect is at this point. I think that's still ongoing, so.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the world of journalism and publishing, and I'm not sure, it's possible that the pandemic accelerated some trends that were already in place, but it had been going on already for at least a decade, that both due to the business model in journalism and publishing and the rise of technologies that made do-it-yourself publishing for both journalism and writing of any type more possible was kind of well underway already, and that has an effect on the hierarchy of what used to be the business and who used to be the gatekeepers. You could self-publish on Amazon, and you didn't need a literary agent or to get a big publisher to accept it. And same thing with so-called citizen journalism. We still want to come back to the curators who really have the quality control in those fields. But in terms of hierarchies among editors and writers and reporters, I don't think that the pandemic was really that decisive one way or another. It's true what you say about just kind of employee-employer relations, like everybody became more flexible. And you hear on the radio how people are rejecting the idea of going back into physical workspace. So in that regard, some employees are losing their power again, where they felt they had more power when they were remote. But I'm not sure that is really true of the writing world. Certainly, book tours couldn't take place. Like when somebody had a book come out and they would go around the country, that couldn't take place during that pandemic, and that was all online. But that was already really decimated even before. Most writers were having to do their own book tours without the publisher paying for it for them.
And I'll just add one brief thing, because you asked about choreographers, dance, and the performative theater world. I think one thing that also came out of it is theater, especially American theater, mainstream American theater, has been undergoing a bit of a reckoning in terms of that, with evaluating, what are these canons that we support? Who is making the theater? How much does it cost to go to the theater? So I think that in one regard, the pandemic definitely allowed a kind of power shift in American theater, sort of think about audiences, but also the importance of the dramaturg and the playwright and the director, right? And the regional theaters that we have around the country, how they're handling this. You might remember, similar to the Oscars thing, like the Oscars So White, there was like a #Theater So White thing that happened like really early on in the pandemic, which was, I welcomed with open arms because it's the nature of the work that I do, but also I think happened because of the pandemic, right? And we're at home and we're thinking about these things, and I found that really necessary, and it's ongoing, right? And hopefully it stays forever, this kind of assessment, this value judgment in a way of the art that we're creating and consuming and marketing.
Definitely, thank you everyone for those answers. Are there any other questions from the audience? All right, thank you for the questions and thank you for the wonderful answers. A video recording will be available on the UCSB Humanities and Fine Arts YouTube channel and other social medias. Type in HFA UCSB on Instagram, X, TikTok, and Facebook to find us. There will also be an article about today's event published on the UCSB Humanities and Fine Arts webpage. Lastly, thank you everyone for joining us today, and feel free to enjoy some refreshments and snacks over there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was fun.
so awesome.